Okay, so you're looking at something on the web, right? And you're like, how did this even get here? Like, how did it go from someone's, lines of code on their computer to this live interactive thing?
Yeah.
And today we are going to be talking about UseItCoin.ca,
Oh, cool.
which is an app.
Okay.
And you can go there yourself and check it out as we talk about it if you want. But
Yeah.
yeah, so we're talking about UseItCoin.ca and kind of like how that goes from just an idea to a real live website.
Right. And I mean, that's like one of the things that I think a lot of people, when they're using the internet, don't really think about like all the stuff that's going on behind the scenes
Yeah.
to make that happen. It's just like
Yeah.
magic. You just go to a website and it works.
Just works.
But there's a lot of like really cool technology that goes into making that happen.
Absolutely. And we're going to go on a deep dive today
Yeah.
into exactly how that happens.
Nice.
And so today we're going to be focusing on DigitalOcean and Docker. And specifically, we're going to be talking about Docker Compose, which is a specific Docker tool.
Right.
And so, yeah, those are the tools that we're going to be looking at today.
Yeah. And I think those are a good choice because they're like pretty popular tools that are used by a lot of people.
Yes.
So it'll be good to learn about them.
Absolutely. And so the goal for today is we want to understand how DigitalOcean provides like the basic infrastructure. So like the server that the website lives on.
Yeah.
And then how Docker makes sure that the application
Right.
runs smoothly on that server.
Yeah. So it's like DigitalOcean is the foundation.
Yeah.
And then Docker is like the house that's built on top of that foundation.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And so like I said, feel free to pull up UseItCoin.ca and take a look at it while we're talking.
Yeah.
But let's start with DigitalOcean.
Okay.
So what is DigitalOcean? What does it offer?
So essentially what DigitalOcean offers is on-demand computing resources in the cloud. So instead of having like a physical server that you own,
Yeah.
and have to maintain yourself, you're basically renting processing power and storage space in their data centers.
Yeah.
Okay. And so for something like UseItCoin.ca, the fundamental building block that DigitalOcean provides is called a droplet.
A droplet. So that's
Yeah.
interesting. So it's not like a
That's not a physical piece of hardware.
physical piece of hardware? No.
No, exactly.
Yeah.
So a droplet is what's known as a virtual private server, or VPS.
Okay.
And what that means for you is that you get like your own isolated virtual machine.
Right.
It has its own operating system, its own allocated resources like memory and processing power, and its own dedicated IP address.
Yeah.
And this is all running within DigitalOcean's network,
Okay.
but you have full administrative rights to it,
Cool.
just as if you had a physical server right in front of you.
Gotcha.
But it's all virtualized and managed by DigitalOcean.
Okay. And we even have the specifics for the UseItCoin droplet.
We do.
It's listed as Ubuntu-S-1vCPU-2GB-3-3-01, running Ubuntu 22.04.
Yeah, that's a lot of...
That looks like a whole code.
It is a little bit of code, but it tells us a lot about the server.
What are the important details we can get from that?
So the Ubuntu part signifies the operating system, and in this case, it's Ubuntu Linux,
Okay.
which is a very popular and stable choice for server environments.
Gotcha.
Then you have the S-1VCP-2GB
Right.
that tells us about the resources that are allocated to the droplet.
Okay.
So it has 2 gigabytes of RAM and 1 virtual CPU core.
Okay.
For a blockchain node like UseItCoin, which can be pretty resource intensive, especially during the initial synchronization process, 2 gigabytes of RAM is a reasonable starting point.
Gotcha.
And the single CPU core suggests that it's probably handling the workload adequately for its current needs.
Yeah.
So FO3 most likely refers to the specific DigitalOcean data center location, probably somewhere in San Francisco.
Gotcha.
And then O1 could just be like an internal identification number. And then we also know from the information we have that it has 50 gigabytes of SSD storage, which is the disk space that's available for the operating system and the application and any data that needs to be stored.
Gotcha. So it's basically a virtual machine
Right.
with a specific operating system,
Yeah.
processing power memory, and it even has a location.
Yeah.
Now, beyond providing the server, what else does DigitalOcean bring to the table?
Okay. So one of the most significant things that DigitalOcean brings is scalability.
Okay.
So let's say, for example, the UseItCoin app suddenly got super popular and there was a huge influx of users.
Yeah.
The owner of the app could very easily resize the droplet.
Okay.
They could upgrade it to have more RAM, more CPU cores, more storage space.
Yeah.
And often this can be done with just a few clicks.
Wow.
And without having to go through like the really complex process of migrating to a completely new physical machine.
Yeah,
So that's a huge advantage.
absolutely.
Then there's networking. So every droplet gets a public IP address.
Right.
Like the one for UseItCoin.ca is 165.232.140.51.
Right. And that's how
And that's how it's reachable on the internet.
our computers find it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They also offer private networking for more complex setups where you might have different droplets that need to communicate securely with each other.
Okay.
And they also have really robust firewall capabilities.
Okay.
So you can control incoming and outgoing network traffic to the droplet.
So that's like the security guard.
Exactly, like a security guard for your server.
Yeah.
It's making sure that only the traffic that you want to allow is actually getting through.
Gotcha.
And then, as we mentioned before, you have a choice of operating systems.
Yeah.
So you can choose whatever operating system makes the most sense for your application.
Right.
And that gives you a lot of flexibility.
Absolutely. And then I know we touched on it earlier, but SSH access.
Right.
Is that really important?
It's very important.
What?
So SSH allows developers and administrators to securely connect to the droplet
Okay.
via the command line.
Right.
And this is how they can configure the server, they can deploy code, they can monitor the application all remotely.
Gotcha. So that's how they control it.
Exactly.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So the core benefit of DigitalOcean is that they provide this fundamental server infrastructure
Right.
with a lot of security features
Yeah.
and a lot of computing power,
Yeah.
and they make it easy to manage.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay, so let's move on to Docker.
All right.
What does Docker do?
So Docker tackles a very common problem in software development.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a problem that we've probably all experienced at some point,
Okay.
which is the infamous "it works on my machine" problem.
Oh, yeah.
Right? So developers often have their applications running perfectly on their local development computers,
Right.
but when that same code is deployed to a different server environment,
Uh-huh.
it can encounter all sorts of issues
Yes.
due to inconsistencies in the operating system or the installed software libraries or the configuration settings.
Yeah.
So Docker solves this by packaging an application and all of its dependencies,
Okay.
everything that needs to run correctly,
Yeah.
into a single self-contained and portable unit called a container.
So it's like a little self-contained bubble.
That's an excellent analogy.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, so it's like you're creating this bubble around your application and everything that it needs to operate, and then that bubble can be moved to any other environment and it'll just work.
Right. And so for UseItCoin, we have a Docker image,
We do.
and that is Nicholas Carlson / UseItCoin -regtest -image.
Yes.
And so what would be in that particular image?
So that image would contain the specifically compiled code for the UseItCoin blockchain node,
Okay.
the required software libraries,
Uh-huh.
the complete runtime environment,
Yeah.
basically everything that's necessary for that UseItCoin blockchain node to execute.
Okay.
And it's a fully self-sufficient package,
Yeah.
which guarantees that this crucial blockchain component of the application will behave consistently, regardless of the underlying infrastructure that it's running on.
So it's like a recipe.
Exactly.
Awesome.
Yeah, and so these containers that we've been talking about,
Mm-hmm.
they're created from what we call Docker images.
Okay.
So think of an image as like a blueprint or a recipe.
Yeah.
It specifies all the necessary components.
Okay.
So the operating system libraries, the application code, the runtime environment, and any configuration files.
Yeah.
And it also includes the instructions on how to assemble them into a running container.
Gotcha.
And those instructions are written in a file called a Docker file.
A Docker file. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, where do these Docker images live?
So that's where Docker Hub comes into play.
Okay.
It's a cloud-based registry, and it's very similar to how GitHub works for storing and sharing code.
Gotcha.
Developers can upload their Docker images to Docker Hub,
Mm.
which makes them accessible for others to download and run.
Okay.
And in this particular case, the Nicholas Carlson / UseItCoin -regtest -image is private,
Okay.
meaning that it's hosted securely on Docker Hub.
Yeah.
And only people with the correct credentials can access it.
Gotcha. So it's like a secret recipe that only certain people have access to.
Yeah,
So
it's like a secret ingredient list.
And what are the major advantages of using Docker in this process?
So there are a lot of advantages to using Docker.
Okay.
One of the biggest ones is consistency.
Yeah.
So we've talked about this a little bit already,
Mm-hmm.
but Docker ensures that your application runs identically across different environments.
Okay.
So whether it's your development laptop, the testing server, or the final production deployment, it's going to run the same way.
Right.
And this is really important because it eliminates a lot of the problems that can come up when you're deploying code to a different environment.
Absolutely.
Then there's isolation. So containers run in their own isolated environments,
Okay.
separate from each other
Yeah.
and from the underlying host operating system.
Yeah.
And this prevents conflicts between different applications that might be running on the same server. And it also helps to improve security because it makes it more difficult for one application to compromise another application.
Makes sense.
Portability is another big advantage.
Yeah.
Because a container bundles everything it needs.
Mm-hmm.
You can run on any machine that has Docker installed.
Right. So it doesn't matter if it's your computer
Right.
or a server in a data center
Exactly.
or a droplet.
Exactly. As long as Docker is installed, the container will run.
Yeah.
And then finally, it greatly simplifies dependency management.
Okay.
So you no longer have to manually install and configure all the required libraries and software on your server.
Yeah.
It's all packaged neatly within the Docker image.
That makes a lot of sense.
Right.
Okay, so Docker helps manage these individual components.
Right.
But what if your application isn't just a single self-contained unit?
Right.
Like UseItCoin.ca.
Right.
It has a blockchain node.
Yeah.
And it has a back-end component.
Yeah.
So how do these different pieces work together?
So that's where Docker Compose comes in. So while Docker helps you manage individual containers,
Yeah.
Docker Compose is specifically designed for managing multi-container Docker applications.
Gotcha.
It allows you to define and run multiple Docker containers of a single coordinated service.
So instead of managing each one individually,
Right.
you can manage them as one big group.
Exactly. And this whole setup is defined in a file called docker-compose.eml.
Okay.
So this is a YAML file where you describe all the different services that make up your application.
Yeah.
So for example, for UseItCoin.ca, you would have the UseItCoin-node service, which would use your custom Docker image.
Mm-hmm.
And you would also have the Kiowa-backend service,
Okay.
which would likely be built from your Node.js backend code.
Gotcha. So this docker-compose.fartnaml file,
Yeah.
it doesn't just list them in parts, right?
No, it does more than that.
It also defines how they talk to each other.
Exactly.
Okay.
So Docker Compose automatically creates an internal Docker network. And this network allows the different containers that are defined in your docker-compose.uml file to communicate with each other seamlessly and securely.
So it's like it handles all the networking behind the scenes.
Exactly. You don't have to worry about figuring out IP addresses or dealing with complex network configurations.
Okay.
Docker Compose just takes care of it for you.
And so what are the advantages of using Docker Compose for something like UseItCoin?
So the biggest advantage is simplified setup and management.
Okay.
So with Docker Compose, you can launch the entire multi-service application with a single command.
One command.
Yeah, it's just Docker space compose space up.
Cool.
And that takes care of everything.
Wow.
It builds the necessary Docker images if they don't already exist.
Yeah.
It creates the containers from those images, and it starts all the services in the correct order,
Yeah.
making sure that all the dependencies are met.
Gotcha.
And as we discussed, it also automatically handles the networking between the services. And then another advantage is that it centralizes all of the configuration for your entire application stack
Okay.
in that single docker-compose.iml file.
Yeah.
So that makes it much easier to understand and manage and version control the overall architecture of your application.
Right. So it's like a one-stop shop.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've got the individual pieces.
Right.
DigitalOcean provides the server infrastructure.
Yeah.
Docker packages the individual applications and their dependencies.
Yeah.
And then Docker Compose orchestrates these multi-container setups.
Right.
How does this all work together in the real world?
Yeah. So let's walk through the typical workflow of developing and deploying an application like UseItCoin.
Okay.
So it typically begins with local development on a developer's machine.
Uh-huh.
So you're writing code, you're creating Docker files for any custom services that you need.
Yeah.
And then you define your entire application environment in the docker-compose.iml file.
Right. And so as a developer, while you're working on your own computer, you would use Docker Compose to build and run the complete application.
Exactly.
Okay.
So by running the Docker space, Compose space up command on your development machine, Docker Compose will build the necessary Docker images based on your Docker files.
Yeah.
And then it will start all the containers that are defined in your docker-compose.eaml file.
Gotcha.
And this gives you a consistent, isolated, containerized environment that closely mirrors your eventual production setup,
Okay.
allowing you to thoroughly test and debug your entire application stack.
So you can make sure that it behaves the same way
Exactly.
on your computer as it will on the server.
Right.
Okay.
So once you're satisfied with your local development and everything's working as it should, The next step is to prepare it for deployment to the live internet.
Okay.
And version control is absolutely crucial at this stage.
Yeah.
You would commit all of your code, including the Docker files and the docker-compose.yaml file, to a version control system like Git.
Yeah.
Often hosted on a platform like GitHub. And this allows you to track all the changes that you've made.
Right.
Collaborate effectively with other developers if you're working on a team. And easily deploy a specific version of your application to your server.
Cool. Okay, so now we need to get all that code onto the server.
Right.
So what happens on the server side?
So first you need to have your DigitalOcean droplet provisioned and running, just like your Ubuntu-S-1 vCPU-2GB-SFO3-01 instance.
Okay.
And on that droplet, you'll need to install the core tools. Okay. So Docker itself, Docker Compose, and Git.
Okay.
These are the fundamental tools that are required to run and manage your containerized application in the cloud.
So you're setting up the droplet to understand Docker.
Yeah, exactly. You're giving it the tools that it needs to work with Docker containers.
And how do you get the application code onto the droplet?
So you would typically establish a secure connection to your droplet using SSH, which is that secure command line interface that we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
And once you're logged in, you would then clone your Git repository.
Okay.
The one that contains all of your application code, your Docker files, and your docker-compose.yaml file.
Yeah.
You clone that directly onto the droplet.
Gotcha.
And then, if your docker-compose.yaml file references private Docker images, like your UseItCoin-rigtest-image that's hosted on Docker Hub, you would also need to log in to Docker Hub on the droplet using the Docker space login command. Okay. So that the droplet has the necessary permissions to download those images.
Gotcha.
Okay. So once the code and configuration files are on the server, the next step is to launch the live application. Okay. And to do that, you would navigate to the directory on your droplet where you cloned your Git repository. Yeah. And then you would execute the same Docker space compose space up command that you used on your local machine. Yeah. But this time you would typically add the dash flag.
Okay, the dash D.
Yeah, so that tells Docker Compose to run the containers in the background, which allows you to close your SSH session and have the application continue running independently. Cool. And then for the very first deployment, or when the application requires some initial setup, you might also run some one-time initialization scripts, such as the fun-wallet.esh script that's mentioned for UseItCoin.ca to set up any necessary initial state or data.
Okay, so with essentially a single command, Docker Compose up -D, the entire application starts running on the server.
Exactly.
That's amazing.
Yeah, it's pretty cool.
But how does the outside world access it?
So that's where a web server like Nginx comes into play.
Okay.
So you would install Nginx directly on your DigitalOcean droplet, and you would configure it to act as a reverse proxy. Okay. So essentially what Nginx does is it listens on the standard web ports. Yeah. So port 80 for unencrypted HTTP traffic, and port 443 for secure HTTPS traffic. And when a user tries to access your website via these ports, Nginx receives the request, and then it forwards it to the specific port that your application's container is listening on internally. Okay. So for example, your Sioa-backend service might be running inside a Docker container and listening on port 3000. And Nginx would be configured to take all incoming requests on port 80 or 443. Okay. And route them to port 3000 within that container. Okay. So Nginx is basically acting as like the front door to your application.
It's directing traffic?
Exactly. It's making sure that the traffic gets to the right place.
Awesome. And what about security?
Security is super important.
Yeah.
So you would typically configure the firewall on your droplet, often using a tool called UFW.
UFW.
Which stands for Uncomplicated Firewall.
Right.
And UFW makes it very easy to restrict incoming traffic to only the ports that are absolutely necessary for your application to function. So in this case, that would typically be port 80 and 443 to allow Nginx to serve your website, and port 22 for SSH access. Yeah. So you can securely manage the server. Okay. And by blocking all other incoming ports, you significantly reduce the potential attack surface.
Right.
And improve the overall security posture of your deployment.
So with all of that, the DigitalOcean droplet running Docker and Docker Compose, The UseItCoin application launched via Docker Compose,
Mm-hmm.
and Jinx acting as a reverse proxy.
Yep.
And the firewall configured.
Right.
Now the application is accessible to users via the IP address or the domain name.
Yeah, so it's now live on the internet.
Awesome. And what are some of the advantages of this whole setup?
So there are a lot of advantages.
Okay.
One of the biggest ones is the develop like you deploy principle.
Okay.
Which basically means that your local development environment should be as close as possible to your production environment.
Right.
And Docker helps to ensure that by packaging everything up into containers, you know that your application is going to run the same way on your development machine as it does on the server.
Right.
And that eliminates a lot of potential issues during deployment.
Yeah.
Another advantage is that the deployment process itself is greatly simplified.
Yeah.
Thanks to Docker Compose.
Yeah.
You can launch your entire application with a single command.
One command. Amazing.
It's very powerful.
Yeah.
It's also highly reproducible.
Okay.
So anyone with Docker installed can essentially recreate the exact same application environment.
Right.
Which is great for collaboration and for ensuring that your application can be easily deployed to different environments.
Yeah.
And then finally, you get the inherent scalability of DigitalOcean for your underlying server resources, combined with the potential for scaling your application services independently using Docker as your needs evolve.
So you can scale up or down as needed?
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's a very flexible system.
Okay, so we've done a deep dive. We have.
Into how DigitalOcean and Docker Compose work together to take a web application like UseItCoin.ca from a developer's computer and make it live on the internet.
Yeah, and it's really cool to see how all of these different pieces fit together to make that happen.
Absolutely. Now, thinking about this whole process, what new possibilities does it unlock for other applications?
So I think this approach fundamentally lowers the barrier to entry for deploying and managing web applications.
Okay.
The speed at which you can iterate on your application increases dramatically because you can make changes, test them thoroughly in your containerized environment, and then deploy those changes very quickly with a high degree of confidence that they're not going to introduce any unexpected problems. It also fosters a greater ability to experiment with new technologies and architectural patterns. Because you can quickly spin up and tear down different containerized services. Without having to worry about complex manual configurations.
And I think perhaps the most significant impact is on the pace of innovation. When the deployment process becomes less of a hurdle and more of a seamless part of the development lifecycle. Developers are free to focus more on creating and refining their applications. Which leads to a more dynamic and feature-rich web for everyone.
So it's like it takes away all the friction of deployment and lets people focus on the important stuff. And cool things. Yeah, so consider how this modern approach directly addresses the historical pain points of software deployment. So think about the configuration nightmares, the dependency conflicts that could take days to resolve the slow and often risky release cycles. This combination of DigitalOcean and Docker offers a much more agile, reliable, and ultimately empowering path from having an idea for a web application to seeing it live and in the hands of users.
Yeah, I think that's a great point.
Yeah.
It really empowers developers to bring their ideas to life more quickly and more easily. And that's a really exciting thing.
Awesome. Well, thanks for joining me on this deep dive.
Yeah, this was fun.
I learned a lot. I hope everyone else did too.
Me too.
And we will see you next time.
All right. See you later.
Bye.